Hi, everybody. Today we're going to talk about immigrations and customs enforcement, the profound changes it's unleashing in American life, and the massive counter-mobilization that we're seeing against it, which I think is turning out to be a highly significant development. We're going to discuss the scope and the extent of the lawlessness and the ethnic hatreds that Trump and Stephen Miller have unleashed, and what it means that popular majorities are largely rejecting what they're doing. We have some fantastic panelists to talk about all this today. Felipe De La Hoz, a New Republic contributing editor, Melissa Gira Grant, a New Republic staff writer, and Raul Pinto, the deputy legal director of transparency at the American Immigration Council, which is a think tank that puts out a lot of really useful materials on all this stuff. I'm Greg Sargent. I'm a New Republic staff writer, and I host the TNR podcast, which is called The Daily Blast. Comes out every day. Check it out. So let's just jump right in. I want to start with Melissa Gira Grant, who's been doing great work covering the clashes between ICE and the American people. Melissa, is there a way to just encapsulate for us kind of the scope of what ICE is doing? You know, how big it is right now, how much bigger is it than it was before, the new infusions of federal money that Trump and Stephen Miller have secured, what its tactics are, and how far it's getting? Can you give us a picture, a big picture?
Sure, absolutely. I'll try. And I'm sure we'll all get into it as well.
Yes.
So if I forget anything, forgive me and please jump in and add it later. It's staggering. I mean, I've reported on immigration in different ways since around 2017. And compared to what Trump was doing in the first administration, there is no comparison in this to what's happening right now. He's taken the immigration system that existed for him on day one of this administration, and there was a lot wrong with the immigration system that he inherited. It, engaged in all kinds of rights violations and dangerous detentions. There were tens of thousands of people being deported before Trump. But what he has done is he's taken that system and turned it into a political tool and turned it into sort of an instrument where he can enact mass terror in communities. This is what I've seen. I'm open to debate, but this is what I've seen. The numbers, to try to give it some sense of what that is. Um, Primarily when we're talking numbers, we're talking about how many agents from ICE and CBP there are now on the streets and how many people that they have taken off the streets. The U.S. Department of Homeland Security says that they have deported 605,000 people since January 20th. Track Reports, an independent body, has a lower number, but I wouldn't be surprised if it comes out to about that. Um, Currently, right now, more than 60,000 people are being held in immigration detention across the country, whether that's in the centers that we've seen in the news, like those in Florida and Texas, Louisiana, or whether that's local jails. People might not even know that in the jail in their community, ICE is locking people up there too. Um,
So that's
we
a high figure, right? For comparatively to previous levels of
60,000,
detention.
it's more, roughly like double where we could have been on average. It's, I think over the years sort of ranged between like 30 and 50 at its highest. Um, there's also like no reason for detaining people who simply have overstayed or, aren't documented in the country, but we can get more into that later.
Yeah.
The idea that there's this many people detained at any given day is staggering. And at the same time, Congress is now tripling the ICE budget. It's making Trump's deportation force. This is how Radley Balco put it in our most recent issue, larger than all but a handful of foreign militaries. And every time the Trump administration talks about how many people they plan to deport, it keeps going up in the millions. But I would just add that, I don't think those numbers really capture what this campaign is. Those arrests are really more like abductions in the ways that they are playing out. That is very different. People are essentially disappearing into ICE detention, and
Yes.
sometimes people are being deported before they could speak to anyone outside of those facilities. And folks might not know this, but people under arrest in the criminal legal system in the US they do have certain rights that people who are arrested and funneled into the immigration system do not have, such as the right to an attorney. And there's also a separate record keeping system for the immigration system. So that makes it even harder for people to be found by their attorneys, their family members. And that's what's adding to a lot of the terror of this. Like people are disappearing into the system. There are people who've been deported before anyone even knew where they were. So, at the top, you talked about this as sort of like the reporting I had done on clashes between ICE and the community. And, I don't think we should equivocate on that at all. I can't describe what's happening when, you have a community that's under siege by ICE and CBP in a way they've never been before. And the response of the community is to try to protect their neighbors, to defend their neighbors from being abducted. It's so clear that ICE and CBP are the ones who are bringing the chaos and the terror into communities. Trump has taken a federal law enforcement agency and uses that also to terrorize people who fight back, which we'll get more into. I really think what's going on right now is he's, you know, seized something that was already quite violent and already quite destructive and made it worse on a scale that it was hard to imagine before this moment.
Well, Melissa, I'd like to pick up on what you said about detention because that was my question for Raul Pinto. A big part of what ICE is doing is largely concealed from the public. And I'm talking about the vast expansion of immigrant detention we're seeing right now. We really only have a piecemeal sense of it from scattered reports and other intelligence. But as you say, this local jail, that local jail can suddenly be packed by ICE. There's private detention centers as well. Raul, I wonder if there's some way to sum up for everybody what do we know about this new detention regime, how it's expanded, how it works, who's getting the money, that kind of thing.
Thank you for having me, first of all. Really good questions, Greg, because I do think that there is a black hole of information when it comes to immigration enforcement, and particularly for individuals in detention. I wanted to start off by talking about sort of the influx of funding, as been, again, picking up on what Melissa was saying, the influx of funding that Department of Homeland Security and therefore ICE received for both enforcement and for detention was staggering. I mean, for detention in itself, they received $45 billion as a result of HR 1, which was the big, beautiful bill. And then ICE, for its enforcement mechanisms and enforcement tactics, they received roughly $30 billion in funding. And so that influx of cash has really changed the tactics and therefore changed the profile of those individuals that are going to be subject to arrest and potential removal, which is commonly known as deportation. And so once you start that understanding, and one of the issues, and definitely not the main issue, but one of the issues that I had with the big beautiful bill is that there were no congressional strings attached to reporting, and so it's very, very difficult. And I'm sure the reporters have encountered this problem, which is very, very difficult to obtain data on how ICE is enforcing immigration laws. And so it's very difficult to kind of get the granular statistics. I've been in conversations with the reporters that talk to me about, well, can I get information about a particular raid in my community? And unfortunately not. It's just database after database that sometimes connect with each other. And so it's very difficult to put those together. And so unfortunately, we don't have a very clear picture as you're pointing out. And I think that there could be things that are accomplished through the appropriations process to really hold ICE accountable for its new tactics. So what does it actually mean in practice, which I'm hopefully answering your question a little bit more directly here. In practice, that means is that ICE is going after people who encounters just on the street. And so during the Biden administration, you saw a little bit of this, but again, picking up on something that Melissa had said, nothing as expansive as what we are seeing now. A more targeted approach, which, when Donald Trump was running for office, he was saying that we're going to target criminals and we're going to really, go into those individuals with criminal records. That's not true. The tactics show something different. And we've seen that in Charlotte, in Chicago, in Los Angeles, where ICE will try to execute an arrest for individuals that they're looking for, but then they'll have the ability to ask for immigration status of any one of those individuals that are around them, and therefore that's how they end up with many more arrests than those where they had a warrant, even if they had a warrant, because obviously many times they do not. And so that means that according to their own statistics, about 41% of people that have been arrested in the past year are people without a criminal record. Whereas before, again, I go back to it, it was a bit more targeted. It was not perfect by any means, but it was a bit more targeted. If you follow that up to how that plays out in detention, that means that the population of individuals in detention actually has grown exponentially. So again, to pick up on what Melissa was saying, at the beginning of January, we saw 40,000 people in immigration detention. That has ballooned up to 66,000, between 60 and 66,000, depending on the figures that you believe. And so that means that you're getting overcrowding in the detention centers. And the other last point that I'll make is that money is actually going to private detention facilities and private prison companies like GEO Group and CoreCivic. 90% of those individuals that are in immigration detention are actually detained in facilities that are either run or owned by these private prison companies. And usually it's the lowest bidder, right? And so they don't necessarily have the best medical conditions. We've seen reports and received anecdotal evidence of the abhorrent conditions that people in detention face. And again, I'll make one last point because I think this is important. I think that all of that environment leads to the fact that detention is now being used as a tool so that immigrants deport themselves, that they don't fight their cases, that they skip the due process that is guaranteed by the U.S. Constitution and just leave the country. And so it's really being used as a tool for people to abandon their rights.
Yeah, I just want to throw something out there for people who may not know this backstory. The reason that under previous presidents like Joe Biden and Barack Obama, at least to some degree, there were fewer arrests of people without criminal records is that they deliberately deprioritized the arrests and removals of people who were not deemed a public safety threat, who had been in the country for a long time. And this is something that Trump ended. He ended the deprioritization of arresting people who are not threats in order to arrest more people and deport more people. Just in one sentence or two, Raul, before we get to Felipe, can you just explain that basic concept? Because I think people don't know that basic backstory.
Yeah, absolutely.
What Trump did, what he changed.
Absolutely. Yeah, so the Obama administration had established a set of 3 basic principles of who they were going to prioritize for removal, and one of them was people that had certain criminal records. The first Trump administration obviously changed that and made that very broad, but at the very, very least, there was still some kind of list that you can go to. The Biden administration then changed that back to something very similar to what was happening during the Obama administration. I will note that the American Immigration Council did a study showing that ICE in and of itself at that time was not necessarily following the protocols and the priorities. So there were many, many cases that were falling through the cracks, and that they were people who were not meeting those priorities, yet they were still arrested. So again, by no means perfect. But what happened this time around was that those prosecutorial guidelines, the procedures that those prosecutors for the government are following as to who to bring charges, who to bring those removal proceedings against, were completely decimated, and therefore it's a free-for-all. So basically anyone now, and I will also add that there have been several cases from the Board of Immigration Appeals that have exponentially expanded those who are subject to mandatory detention, particularly those who have crossed the border without authorization, and so that's also problematic.
I just want to underscore a key point about all this, which is that for Trump and especially Stephen Miller, and we have a big story on Stephen Miller's Real Worldview in the New Republic. People should please check that out. For them, they're obsessed with the number of people that they're removing from the country because they're trying to pull off something like an ethnic re-engineering. And so you can't get the numbers up to the levels that Stephen Miller and Trump want without going after the people who have been living here for 10, 15, 20 years. And that's why they're going after them, because their goal is to get as many immigrants out of the country as possible, period, full stop. Their goal has nothing to do with public safety. Um, I want to go to Felipe now. Um, so Felipe's written very well about the accountability side of things, and I think that's sort of an untold story of the moment, that ICE's activities are being aided in a way by this functional gutting of oversight, both congressional oversight and, from what I've been able to determine, oversight mechanisms inside the agency. Felipe, can you talk about that? Like, what sort of oversight over ICE should there be right now? What's missing? Like, what would it look like if we had real oversight?
Sure. And to underscore one thing also, by the way, that Raul was talking about in terms of the prioritization, the reason we've seen the numbers shift so dramatically is also because, it's much easier actually to arrest people who are not trying to sort of evade notice or
Yes,
capture. And so I think that's just sort of an important point to make,
critical
right?
point. Yeah, absolutely.
But to get to your question about accountability, I mean, I think, there's really an attempt right now within the federal government to turn the federal immigration agencies as a whole into kind of border patrol, which has long had its own sort of very paramilitaristic culture, right? And sort of sees itself as this kind of vanguard of defending the nation. And I think that's the culture that they are trying to sort of institute throughout the department, which means, I mean, I have, sources within the department and, for the most part, a lot of them also actually feel that this is not what they sort of signed up for. People who are, within, for example, the component of ICE that investigates, child sexual abuse material or counterfeiting within the FBI, within the DEA, within, even IRS agents are being drawn into this. And so I think, there's a sense that, this is the one mission internally now. In terms of outside accountability, I know we're going to get to Congress in a little bit, but for the most part, they've been pretty absent. I think in almost all types of oversight over the sort of authoritarian impulses of this administration. Of course, at a later time they could, hold oversight hearings and all these things. I'm sure we'll talk about that. But I think right now we have to look a little bit beyond Congress, given its sort of ineffectiveness. I wrote recently a piece, actually about the potential of state prosecutions for sort of, federal agents that were sort of clearly violating the law. I had written, a little bit towards last summer about what governors could do. I think in general, we need to start seeing a lot more state power flexing, which is something that I think, sort of blue state, executives generally are a little bit sort of loath to do. And it has kind of a conservative understanding in the popular imagination, the whole states' rights thing. But I think right now is sort of a time when there can be this exertion of state authority, for example, policies that would limit the ability of agents to engage in warrantless arrests or to be masked. We've seen some bills around that. Even just the masking issue in the last several weeks and months. And I also think that the courts right now are sort of an interesting bulwark to some extent, not uniformly. Obviously, the Supreme Court has a very different, I think, mandate than the rest of the federal judiciary right now. But we've seen a number of federal judges kind of step in and block administration policies and initiatives, order the return of Kilmar Garcia, for example, one district judge, and some of these other things where I think that needs to go. And this is obviously, a lot of these things are kind of untested to some extent in the history of the country, but certainly, we live in uncommon times. Are, judges taking a more proactive role, not only in kind of telling, the federal government to stop violating the law, but taking some form of action in response to such violations. I and other people have talked about the prospect of using contempt, in some ways to actually sort of identify and punish officials that are, very egregiously ordering or carrying out sort of unlawful acts. In general, I also think there's like two prongs here to the accountability. There's the sort of, punishment or dissolution of illegal actions. And then there's the transparency issue that we've all been talking about here. We talked about detention a little bit, but the lack of transparency goes well beyond that, right? We've found out about, federal agents utilizing, for example, widespread facial recognition in the field, not from any sort of, government communications about it, but from reporting in this publication by our colleagues at 404 Media and Wired, we found out about, some of the kind of like third party negotiations to send people to sort of other countries that are not their countries of origin, sort of form reporting from individual members of Congress, sort of sending inquiries. So, before we can even really start to take stock of everything that needs to happen in order to kind of engender accountability, I think, a big first step there is to kind of really try to, push to learn everything that's actually going on. We had the kind of the breakdown of the walls in government data where, IRS data, selective service data, Medicare data is being, pulled into, or they're attempting to pull it into these sort of like vast, government databases for use in immigration enforcement and probably other things too, which is another point that I think is worth making, which is that none of this is going to be confined to immigration enforcement, right? That was never the objective, and that's not where we're going to end up. Unfortunately, sometimes it's difficult to get people to care about things that they don't feel are going to affect them. But I can really assure everyone that this is all going to affect you, right? It's not going to stop, at sort of the detention of criminals or even undocumented immigrants or whatever. These are systems that are expanding outward, and sort of everyone's going to sort of be in the crosshairs eventually.
Great, thanks for that. I want to go to Melissa again. Melissa had a very good piece. People should check this out. That laid out how Chicago citizens mobilized against ICE's raids and tactics in that city. It's been my view for some time that the counter-mobilization we're seeing in the face of ICE is really a meaningful thing. It's a significant development. And Melissa, I was hoping you could address that. It looks like there's like a real cultural moment underway, kind of a backlash to not just the immediate tactics that we're seeing, but also to the, underlying Trump-Miller goal of, I guess, ethnic purification, which is that's a crude way to put it, but it's something like that. Can you talk about what you're seeing in terms of this cultural backlash and what it means?
Yeah, absolutely. I've witnessed some of it firsthand in Chicago and in New York, but I think it really kicked off in a way that took national attention anyway in Los Angeles this summer. The operations there that ICE and Border Patrol, you know, subjected immigrants in Los Angeles and others they profiled as immigrants in Los Angeles. I mean, that violence was so obvious, right? Like, I think that's sort of like this paradox of this administration is they don't hide from the violence of these operations. In fact, they make like promotional videos out of them and post them and use them as recruitment materials. So the the fact that they don't seem to mind, I don't think that undercuts the power of actually seeing it and not just seeing, these scenes of violent arrests and people being abused outside courtrooms, outside schools, but people are also seeing people show up and defend those people. All of the people who came out in the streets in Los Angeles, all of the people who came out in the farms that were raided on the, outside Los Angeles, and, as we've seen in Chicago and as we've seen in other cities, when ICE shows up, people show up to confront them. This is just how it is right now. And it was interesting because I think back in June, there was still this conversation that seems sort of detached from reality that like, well, where is the resistance? The resistance isn't here this time. And like this resistance actually feels so much more effective and powerful. Like people can actually do something right now where they live that matters. The only thing I can really liken it to is, the protests around the Muslim travel ban in 2017 when people turned up to airports. It was an immigration group that sent out the mass text blasts on that in New York. And that was, hundreds of thousands of people probably participated in those demonstrations across the US. And they aren't just a demonstration. Like I think sometimes they get referred to as protests or demonstrations, but this is a different practice. This is something that kind of grew out of crop watching practices, going back to the 1960s and what the Black Panthers were doing in Oakland, California. Activists have since adapted that to follow police in the United States, both to like be there for somebody in a police encounter, but also to capture evidence of possible rights violations that could be very useful to them later in court, and also to give people in the community something to do to step up. So this didn't come out of nowhere. And it's not really, or it's not only a protest. It's community defense. It's direct action. It's a way of actually using your body and yourself and your power, honestly, if you're not, if you're less arrestable than the people that ICE are coming for, people are making that decision to come outside their homes and defend people. And, when I was in Chicago, like a lot of the people that I talked to who were doing this kind of work in rapid response networks where, they would get messages about like where ICE might be in their particular neighborhood in that morning. And they're like very organized and very decentralized. And the people who are doing that work, might not even like know each other, or it might be their next door neighbor. They are also, facing some pretty big risks themselves. This administration is certainly sees any sort of interference with these arrests as itself a crime, and it's not, or not most of the time. They, you know, underestimated people. And I think that's given people an advantage. The way that I look at it is the crackdown on communities who come out and support their neighbors when these operations are happening. What you get then is a nice crackdown on those people who come out to support them. And then you get scenes of like what happened in Chicago around Halloween, like kids in their costumes choking on tear gas. Like it's so easy to mobilize people, I think, when they're seeing that in their community. And I feel like they should have seen this coming. I think they thought they could hide behind this idea that they were only going after criminals. They would that they could convince the public that there was this new kind of threat called a criminal alien that they had to be protected from, that were huge dangers to the community. It was a convenient scapegoat for them. But, even last summer, Tom Homan, Trump, in addition to Stephen Miller, Trump's sort of go-to guy on immigration, you often see him on TV. He sort of feels like their pitch man, and he's been on Fox quite a lot even before this. He actually worked in the Obama administration, and under Trump's first administration was one of the architects of the family separation policy. So, he was going around last summer saying, like, look, even this is not how he put it, but anyone who has entered the United States without authorization, just doing that, you're a criminal. That's enough. It's less than a misdemeanor is the best way I could explain it. Raul could probably explain it much more precisely, but this is not a criminal offense that we put people in detention for a very long time. This
I'd
is
love to throw
not a
something
criminal
out.
offense. But I think the thing that like, whatever, most people don't know that. They're not going to get into the weeds of that. But I think that they just thought the idea of a criminal was going to be enough to make people pause, not want to defend somebody, think somebody was maybe deserving of what was happening. So you have Homan saying no one's off the table, quite literally. And I do think that they thought that they could ride on that. And then when the Lake and Riley Act passed in January, when I saw so many Democrats who supported that, this is a law that makes people who have merely been charged with certain crimes, to be funneled into this system of deportation. This is outrageous. Like these are people who like haven't even had a chance to, have due process in the criminal court system, and they're immediately pushing them into immigration detention. People supported that. Democrats supported that. And I think we're somewhere different right now. Like, I think if that law was on the table right now, the
Yeah.
conversation would look very different. It may still pass, honestly. There's enough support and enough fear, I think, in the Democratic Party of not being like tough on immigration. But it's so obvious that people, like, when they go out in the street to defend somebody from ICE, they're not asking, are you a criminal? It's not about that. It's everyone. They see the attack on everyone. They see it on themselves. And I haven't seen anything like that before. Not on
The
this scale.
the propaganda from the administration is really tortured and self-contradictory on this as well. You've got this, they've debuted this phrase that you brought up, criminal illegal alien, which is meant to make you see every illegal or undocumented immigrant as a criminal. But then they feel the need to say we're going after the worst of the worst because they actually know that lots and lots of people are now in full opposition to the removal of people who don't pose any kind of public safety threat. And so they're caught between their messaging to the base, which is that, every brown person in the country is a criminal, versus, everyone who's undocumented in the country is a criminal, versus on the other side saying, we're really, really making you safer. But the bottom line that I think is missing from a lot of the coverage, and maybe you guys can comment on this, is that they're choosing to remove lots and lots of immigrants over public safety, right? They're actually shifting enormous amounts of resources, federal law enforcement resources, away from serious crimes like child trafficking and drug trafficking and into deportation. So they're calling what they're doing an anti-crime initiative, but they're actually making us less safe by removing people who aren't a danger and putting all the resources into that. I don't know. Do you guys, I don't know who wants to comment on that, but it seems to me that's missing from a lot of the coverage, this basic choice they're making.
Yeah, I mean, I can jump in just briefly, but
Yeah.
here, I mean, I know a lot about the kind of the field operations here in New York City. I had someone who was involved in some of the planning tell me that they're sending some agents to St. Paul because I quote that idiot YouTuber, and sort of the sort of the policy is being set by these kind of like this desire for spectacle. But like there are people, as you said, who are involved in investigations of a high caliber, have been involved in investigations of a high caliber, who are doing basically beat cop stuff out on the street, checking IDs, for people who are of a certain type, right? Here in New York, it was the kind of the Canal Street counterfeit sellers or whatever that again was the result of an obsession of right-wing influencers who are basically calling the shots now. But I think this is kind of an opportunity to gain some allies here rhetorically, politically, that might not kind of otherwise be in ideological cahoots with, I guess, us in the more left-leaning political and media environment, but because this it is a public safety issue. I know that, for example, also there's a the libertarian sort of wing of political thought, is very much opposed to a lot of these things because it is an enormous expansion of state power, right? People that, wouldn't necessarily be kind of on board with a lot of the other things that, we might be on board with here in, at the Republic. But, I think that that's like a good spot to kind of hook onto as well to kind of build some additional, public opposition to some of these things.
Absolutely. Well, let me go on to Raul. I think at this point, Democrats need to articulate what you might call an anti-ICE agenda. It could have involved maybe abolishing the agency, but it wouldn't have to necessarily. It could involve substantially defunding it, or maybe placing a lot of new legislative checks on it, and maybe a much more clearly defined mission, set of missions, and set of guidelines. And like I said earlier, some new systems of accountability built into the executive branch, maybe with some independence, something like that. Now, I know getting something like this passed into law is not realistic, obviously, in the near term. But if Democrats were to articulate such an agenda concretely, what do you think it should look like, Raul? What does an anti-ICE agenda look like?
Yeah, for me, you're hitting on a key term, which is accountability. That's where I would start. As I said before, I think providing the levels of funding that they're getting without a significant requirement that they report to the American people what is being done with their tax dollars was a colossal mistake. And that leaves nonprofit organizations like the American Immigration Council, like TRAC, who was mentioned before, like the Detention Deportation Data Project, to really use FOIA and all of the issues that come with a FOIA request and FOIA litigation to try to obtain information that it's often not clear, it is often not accessible to the public, and so I think that that would be my first starting point, and I think that that's not necessarily, or at least shouldn't be necessarily, a controversial measure for an administration that has claimed to be one of the most, if not the most, transparent in American history, right? And so I think transparency just is the starting point where I think you could get some bipartisan support on that. And at the end of the day, it's really just making information available to the public about the agencies and how they're conducting their operations. I think the second sort of slew of issues go to some of the things that we've already talked about, which is, for example, just again very quickly, we've seen California adopt SB 627, which prohibit or limited very restrictively the use of masks by ICE officers. Right, an accountability measure that can be imposed upon the agency, because the public should know if an individual is being arrested by an agent of ICE. There were many, many stories that came out through reporting where ICE officers weren't even wearing badges, and so it's and they don't wear distinctive uniforms, and so many people thought, we're being kidnapped here. We don't know who's taking us, and so I think adding accountability measures from that regard on the identification front, I think, are going to be very important. And the second area that I would highlight is also just the cooperation with local law enforcement agencies and 287G agreements. I'm going to go back a second and say that 287G agreements, for example, are agreements where a local law enforcement agency basically enters into a contract with the federal government so that officers from that local law enforcement agency can conduct certain immigration duties. And we saw a ballooning of 287G agreements basically starting on January 21st. When the Trump administration took office. And so I think that there is countless of studies and information about how those agreements and how that cooperation really erodes the trust that local communities have on their local law enforcement agencies. And so I think that could also be another starting point for potential reform and potential to overhaul. And I will say this, that doesn't have to come from Congress as well. That's something that grassroots communities and that advocacy that can work at the grassroots level, because those contracts are actually signed by your city council, your sheriff's offices, your county commissioners, and so that's advocacy that can be engaged at that local level. And then finally, I would say, and it goes to a question that I saw on the chat about representation. Right now, we're seeing limitations on legal representations at every step of the immigration process for an individual, particularly for those in immigration detention. And for example, we've seen many cases, obviously, with transfer. This is an issue that's near and dear to my heart, where you arrest someone, for example, in New York, and then you are very quickly transferred out of the jurisdiction of the New York field office into a detention facility in Louisiana, in Texas, or very close to the border. That makes it that much harder for people to obtain counsel. We saw, for example, there was a letter by the American Bar Association last year where transfers were happening even for people that had already secured an attorney. And obviously that makes it much harder to defend your case. And again, it's just that erosion of due process for immigrants so that they actually kind of leave the country and abandon their potential cases. I think there was some congressional proposals a few years ago to limit those transfers. I'd love to kind of see that happen again, because we know that those transfers are happening fast and furious, and it very well impacts how an individual defends themselves in court.
Yeah, well, it's a terrific agenda. Good start. Felipe, there's a reasonable chance Democrats could take back the House next year. If so, what could they realistically do in terms of oversight on ICE, or potentially using the budget process to try to bring down the amount of money that's being dumped into these kinds of black holes that we're talking about? Obviously, they can't really pass things themselves, but House Democrats will be in control of one chamber, potentially, if they win. So what would be the ideal approach for them to use to take that power that they could have in the House to get ICE under control? What specifically do you hope to see them do?
Yeah, I mean, and I think to get there in the first place, not a bad message would not be to, say that accountability will occur. And I think that there's all this talk all the time about, Democrats going too far left and blah, blah, blah. We've had this debate a million times over a million issues, but I don't actually think there's that much debate right now about where the base stands. People hate this stuff. I mean, the Democratic base, particularly, and independents do too. So I don't actually, this is not, I think, a complex sort of political messaging issue, right? People don't like this, and they want people, they want candidates who say so. So, presuming that Democrats do take the House, at least, I think there are a few things here. I mean, first, the Congress has the power to, subpoena officials, right, and sort of demand, disclosure of certain operational, factors, right. So, for example, I think the Congress could really try to get to the bottom of where everyone's data is being pooled, right. An issue that I sort of discussed earlier. I think Congress could more concretely enforce use cases on sort of funding allocations, right. We saw that, budgetary language prohibited ICE from blocking members of Congress from entering, locales where people were being detained, and they were still routinely blocked. They had to sue. Several members of Congress had to sue to be able to gain access to detention facilities, which was black letter law, right? Completely non-interpretable. And so, I think that should really put some of the funding in question, right? If they're not permitted to use funding for XYZ purposes, then they shouldn't get that funding. I think as we touched on earlier, also the between the sort of existing fiscal year 25 and then the big beautiful bill funding, that's about $200 billion to ICE and sort of immigration enforcement more broadly. That's a dispersal that can happen over the course of 10 years, which means like most of it has not been dispersed and it can be clawed back. Now, obviously, Democrats can't do that unilaterally with just the House, right? But that should be something that's discussed, right? I mean, this money is not out the door. It can be taken back. And I think, more broadly, there's like we've all heard the phrase, comprehensive immigration reform, which is like a Rorschach test. Everybody has a different interpretation of what that means. But, we have to look at the fact that we're in this situation, at least in part because Congress, over decades, not just now, has effectively abdicated a lot of, its responsibilities around immigration in particular to the executive. The president sets the refugee numbers. The president, can sort of just unilaterally dictate prioritization of immigration enforcement. The president has 212F, which is the power under which, the various travel bans have been issued, which is an incredibly broad power that's basically a get out of the statutory framework free card. And so all this stuff, that kind of, has just been foisted on the executive, and that, these people, Stephen Miller primarily, have used to maximum advantage. They're picking up tools that are there. And I think, Democrats need to be clear-headed about actually changing some of the statute here to reel those things back, to reassert their own power over, immigration, and to make it a more independent system, right? The immigration courts, which we've been talking about, most people are not aware, are not Article 3 courts. They are not part of the federal judiciary. They are administrative courts under the Department of Justice. And as Raul mentioned earlier, the sort of appellate body that is again within DOJ has already issued all sorts of precedential decisions that make it much easier for people to be detained and all this stuff. There's no reason that that the prosecutor and the judge should be part of the same branch of government, right? So things like that are, yes, a bit technical, but that I do think voters are capable of understanding. I think really need to be on the table here. Like, let's not be afraid of talking about some of the structures that are in place that have led us here, that can be reformulated. Even just kind of turning back the clock a bit. The Department of Homeland Security did not exist until 2003. Obviously the precursor agencies did exist and they had their problems, but you could argue, and I've argued and others have argued, that a lot of the ethos of the contemporary agency is a very war on terror ethos. And then that's partly, given the structure and intent of the agency. And so, all of this should be on the table, right? The sort of presumption of regularity, as the kind of legal term goes, is out the window, and so we have to kind of discuss structural changes here. And I think that, the public is ready and willing to kind of engage with that. And that should be part of the, especially if Democrats take the House, these should be real conversations that are happening.
Yeah, 100%. And I want to underscore your point, which is that people hate this stuff. Like, that might sound to some people like a throwaway line, but it's really essential. There's a very deep, intuitive hatred of what ICE is doing out there in the country right now, and it's very widespread, and it's reaching people who you wouldn't ordinarily think would be reached by this kind of thing. For instance, you have Joe Rogan, not known as a liberal, out there really forcefully denouncing what he's seeing from ICE. And I think that's probably a clue that there's a very large body of disaffected voters out there who maybe are seduced by MAGA a little bit or Trump a little bit. Trump is cool or whatever, right? Trump popped up on their social media feed. Young voters like who are sort of, I don't know, swayed into voting for Trump because of the economy that just think this stuff is insane. And there's an opening here for Democrats to speak to these people about this stuff in like adults and in a sane way. Uh, let's take a question from the audience here. This is a good one. Maybe Melissa, you could take this. The question is, how do you join the fight if you live in a rural red state and ICE/CBP raids do not exist, other than contact my legislators? Melissa, can you address that? You do have some of this going on in some red states a little bit, but there are plenty of people out there in red America who maybe are seeing this stuff on the news or seeing it appear on their phones, on Instagram, so forth, and are very troubled by it. What can they do?
That's a great question. I wanted to sort of talk about things at the local scope since we just covered the national scope so well. Thank you, Felipe. Thank you, Raul. The local is sort of where people are most mobilized right now. So there's a lot of energy, even if you're not in a community where, there's immediately a threat. There's lots you can do. And in fact, it's easier to organize sometimes when you're not constantly living under this fear. That's one of the hardest things that folks who are on the front lines in that way are dealing with is it has just so disrupted their day-to-day life. It's meant to wear people down, and they don't get to do this sort of like deeper, more strategic organizing work while they are doing that rapid response work. So all different levels of this work, are there. It's just what's getting the attention right now is this rapid response work. One thing people could get involved in where they are in red states especially is both monitoring and attempting to close detention centers, immigration detention centers. Raul's laid out the different kinds of immigration detention that there are. Everything from the local jail that has 2 beds because of a 287G agreement to, Alligator Alcatraz, the concentration camp in the Florida Everglades, or the Crone Detention Center that's been there before that, or the detention centers in Louisiana. And there's constantly new attempts to try to bring detention centers into other states. They sell them the same way they sell prisons. Oh, this is going to be, a job bringer to this neighborhood or this community. And these detention centers for immigrants have been successfully blocked from opening and shut down when they did. There's a group called Detention Watch Network. I was thinking of them when Felipe was talking about sort of the way that immigration has become rewritten as like a national security issue after 9/11. This is why ICE exists at all as part of DHS. This idea that like we have to detain people who entered the United States unauthorized or who live here undocumented, that like that requires them to be locked up for the course of their immigration case. Like it wasn't always like that, and it doesn't need to be like that. And in fact, it's quite recent, and it's never happened at this scale. Like what we are seeing right now, and I think what people are responding to, is immigration detention is being used as punishment, whether as an extension of the criminal legal system. What we were seeing in New York is people were getting out of Rikers on whatever kind of low-level charge they got sent to the jail for. There are some people who are on shorter sentences who may actually end up serving out their whole sentence in that jail and not going to a prison. They would get out of Rikers for whatever reason, and there was an ICE office on Rikers. And so then ICE is grabbing people and taking them into custody, and they're being put through immigration proceedings. So those kinds of relationships can be broken. There is some great work like mapping which communities have 287G agreements. There are so many. There are so many in Florida that weren't there a year ago. Ron DeSantis has really pushed this. I believe in Kansas, there's some work around a new immigration detention center in the process of trying to open right now. So yeah, I would check out Detention Watch Network. I'll find the link to the 287G, the group who's been tracking those agreements across the country. This also can bring lots of different groups together. Like there are folks who are, working on prison and jail conditions, who may not be working on immigration, who would want to be part of this work. Certainly all kinds of lawyers who, have different expertises, whether it's like documenting kinds of abuse or bringing civil rights cases, or people who are immigration attorneys who can give you expert information about how people move through these very like black box systems. Like it is difficult to understand them, and it's intentionally so. But it's not impossible. And there's so much knowledge, I think, in the immigration justice movement about how these systems work. So, yeah, Detention Watch Network, closed detention centers, and 287G agreements, those are definitely in red states.
Thanks for that. I'll bring up another audience question. Could the panel address the extent to which snatch and detain has been deployed against non-immigrants opposing the administration's immigration policies and tactics, and against Trump's political enemies generally? I think this is a good question because, anyone who's on social media or sort of reads the news casually or not so casually sees this come across the transom from time to time. Here's a story of a non-immigrant who was detained. Here's a story of a citizen who was detained. But it's all very piecemeal again. And I don't think anybody really has a sense of, I certainly don't feel like I have a good sense of what the real scope of it is and how serious it is. Raul, do you think you could address that?
Yeah, that's a very good question because of the issues that you're pointing to, Greg. There's no real documentation of U.S. citizens that are actually detained. The council did a study a couple years now about CBP's actions out of a particular station in Ohio, the Sandusky Bay station, and in that case, we actually requested something called the apprehension logs, which allowed us to see that about 20, I believe it was 21 or 22% of those individuals that were detained were U.S. citizens. And so you see the impacts of the dragnet that was implemented on people who had really no reason as to why they were being detained or stopped. Whether the Trump administration has continued to keep those logs, we haven't done a FOIA request for that information. But yeah, it's very, very difficult to see exactly U.S. citizens that have been detained, and perhaps Felipe and Melissa have had better luck trying to get some of that information.
Yeah, I just posted ProPublica did some good work on this, a couple of months ago, but I'm not aware of any kind of sort of central repository where that information is held. I mean, and I think there implied in that question, Greg, is also the idea that some of these some of them are random, right? We've seen, agents kind of just jumping out and come grabbing people who turn out to be citizens because they're not really using a lot of discretion in who they're grabbing. But some of them are targeted, right? We've seen a lot of, federal agents kind of cracking down on protests, right? We saw this in Chicago quite a lot, as Melissa, I'm sure, can speak to in some more detail, in LA and elsewhere, where, people who are very clearly engaged in First Amendment protected activity. And in many cases, I don't think there's even really any allegation that they, obstructed traffic or whatever it is that they're kind of being slapped with, are being detained. And I think that is, just something that's kind of worth emphasizing, and it's part and parcel with kind of the parallel and related crackdown that the administration is trying to have on speech. Which has some very clear ties to the crackdown on immigration, very, very explicitly in, for example, the form of people like Mahmoud Khalil, where immigration is sort of the mechanism by which the speech crackdown occurs, and some of the visa restrictions we've seen. So I do think that it's worth kind of keeping in mind and emphasizing that it's in tandem, right? The crackdown on immigration and the crackdown on speech more broadly are sort of parallel efforts here.
Thanks
Can
for
I
that,
just add a
Felipe.
detail on that quickly? Sorry, on the
Oh,
speech and
yeah,
press side of it.
absolutely.
I think one of
Please.
the more successful legal actions in Chicago was a lawsuit that was brought by journalists, activists, and local faith leaders. Full disclosure, the New Republic is part of the News Guild, and the News Guild in Chicago is one of the parties to the suit, one of the plaintiffs. And it was about use of force against people when they're engaged in either news gathering or other kinds of First Amendment activity, such as protesting. And it's been very difficult to hold ICE and CBP officers accountable for the violence that they are doing in the course of arrests, for the retaliation they're engaging in against people who are defending. This is really an after the fact kind of litigation. Please correct me if I'm wrong, but it really seems like, you know, it even these restraining orders that, were won to restrain ICE and CBP activity were like constantly fought over, constantly violated, but it created this chain of documentation. And I think it actually gave some people, whether they were press, like I certainly felt a little bit safer working in Chicago having this. I had like I think every agency that was under a TRO, which is like probably half a dozen DHS agencies, in my backpack ready to show to somebody if they ever stop me. Do I think that would 100% protect me? No, but I think it's important to see these parallels between the ways that people are reporting on immigration, opposing immigration enforcement, and immigrants who are being arrested themselves are really in the same boat in a lot of ways.
Greg, you're muted.
Sorry, guys. My dog was making a racket in the background, so I had to mute. I guess I'll close this out with Felipe. I think we just had some news the other day that Department of Homeland Security announced this explosion in ICE officer recruitment. I forget the exact figure, but it seemed to be something like doubling the current number at least. I think one has to treat everything that DHS says as a lie until it has to be presumed a lie until it's shown to be true. But broadly speaking, Felipe, what do you expect ICE to look like in 2026 and 2027? How much worse is this going to get? Will the opposition sustain itself against this? Stephen Miller's trying to exhaust us all, I think, and get everyone to kind of roll over and accept his authoritarianism. I don't think that's going to happen, but what do you see on all those fronts, Felipe?
Yeah, I mean, I think you have to take a look at sort of the tenor and sort of type of some of the recruitment ads, right, that have been put out there, which are very, very clearly winking to, kind of like not even highly intellectualized races. It's very gutter kind of, Camp of the Saints stuff. And obviously that's going to kind of,
Felipe, can you
attract.
tell people what Camp of the Saints is?
Yeah,
Because
it's
I
a
think a lot of
book.
people don't know that.
It's a novel written by sort of a French, racist author that very, generally speaking, has been adopted as a kind of, ideological Bible for people who are kind of in the camp of like remigration, like ethnic cleansing, white ethnic cleansing kind of thing. And there's a lot of kind of aesthetics around that movement, right? The return people and all that. And I think that's very present in the recruitment push that ICE is doing, which, is going to lead to a certain kind of person, I think, applying.
Yes.
I'm not going to sit here and defend ICE as an agency, but I will say that, there were at least certain level, some minimum standards, for most of the lifespan of the agency. And it does seem like, those are being kind of whittled down to the point where, I don't know who's going to be, at this point given a gun and a badge. I mean, from what I've heard, they're sort of like, reducing standards at the law enforcement training academies. I've heard certain rumors about the law enforcement training academies, and the kind of, the kinds of people that they're getting there. I can't really, verify all of that right now, but, I think that we're going to see an agency not only that, has recruited a certain person who's very much like ideologically on mission and on brand with what Stephen Miller wants to do, but that has seen that they will be protected, right? Like that they feel like they're not going to have to sort of, suffer any repercussions for conduct that, exceeds the bounds of the law, that, is sort of, personally gratifying. I think there's a real concern about, grift and assault and all sorts of things that might happen with this population of agents, especially, when you kind of mix certain personalities with very vulnerable people, things don't tend to go very well. We've already seen that. And so I'm very worried, yes, that kind of thing will increase.
Well, I guess what I would say, similar to what Melissa said earlier, everybody should be as vigilant as they possibly can and find whatever way they can to contribute to fighting back against this absolute madness that we're seeing. And I hope Democrats figure out that there's a major opening here to speak directly to the country, including a lot of the low information, disaffected voters who were constantly told they have trouble reaching. Well, this stuff is reaching them. So Democrats have an opening here. I hope they take it. I want to thank our panelists, Felipe De La Hoz, Melissa Gira Grant, and Raul Pinto, who jumped off a bit early. That was a fantastic discussion. And folks, we will be emailing out a video of this whole thing to our list. I know some people asked about that, so thank you so much for joining.
Thanks, Greg.
Yeah, thanks everyone.